Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey, how are you guys? Hope you're doing well. I can't hear your response, but I hope it's good. If not, I got you. Just feel better, please. Let's go. Victorian warriors, the brutal reality of the men who built the British Empire. Sounds interesting to me. Original link to the video from Red Coat History. Great name. Subscribed. I'm gonna preemptive like. Let's learn.
Independent! Fire at will!
Zulu.
Very nice of him.
During Queen Victoria's reign, the British Army fought in more than 60 military campaigns, fighting on every continent against tough foes like the Cossacks, the Zulus, and the Pathans of the northwest frontier.
When did the British fight the Cossacks? Crimean War, maybe? I thought the Cossacks didn't exist at that point.
But what was the Zulus and the Pathans of the northwest frontier? But what was life really like for these hard men? Men famously despised by the civilians all around them. Forget the romance of redcoats and glory. Today we're telling the real story of the lads who took the Queen's shilling, how they were recruited, their daily routine, and of course, their sex lives.
Look at our motto. Always ready for action.
It was a hard world of sweat, mud and camaraderie. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover every aspect of their lives, but we'll do our best. Let me know in the comments if you think you could have survived the demanding life of the men who built up and defended the empire in the post-Waterloo
Easily, I could have. No.
era.
The answer is no. I'm just going to say that before I...
So let's be clear, the British Army was, and still is, a volunteer outfit, and it took a mix of charm, cunning and the occasional bit of trickery to keep its ranks filled. Even during the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain wasn't just trying to win but to survive, the army never went down the conscription route. In 1815, the year of Waterloo, they could manage about 234,000 men. A lot, right? But as we know, governments are famously tight, and they tightened those purse strings as soon as Napoleon was shipped off to Helena. They wasted no time slashing numbers. Extra battalions within regiments were cut, and some regiments were disbanded altogether. By the time Queen Victoria took to the throne in 1830,
I love the Victorian era. I don't have a huge reason for it. It's just a feeling I get. Kind of romantic feeling. I swear it goes back to like my love for the Christmas Carol. I've seen plays of it and movie adaptations. But I think the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens might have preceded the Victorian era. And so maybe that doesn't make any sense. But just when the British Empire was at its strongest, you could argue it was at like 1920 where it was at its largest. But at its strongest compared to other powers, I'd imagine was the mid to late 1800s. And something about it is I get a romantic feeling for it. It's hard to explain, but it's there.
the armaments were disbanded altogether. By the time Queen Victoria took to the throne in 1837, the army had shrunk to just 88,000 men, and funding had been chopped by nearly 80%. They were overstretched, scattered across the globe. Obviously, bear in mind, though, that even 88,000 men was a lot more than we have today, where the number's around 73,000. Okay, now let's talk about the recruiting sergeant. Look at this group, studs a lot of them. But be wary, they're paid a bounty for each man they enlist, so they'll cut corners and get you in. Join the army, they'll shout, see the world, be a hero, make the ladies swoon. What he left out? The world was mostly desert, jungle and swamp, and the only swooning was generally because of sunstroke or dysentery. So, after a few too many pints, you wake up and realise you've signed up and gone for a soldier. Well, the good news is that you do get paid. The pay's $1 a day. Sounds all right? Well, the pay hasn't gone up in decades, and once they deduct the cost of your food, accommodation and uniform repairs, you'd be lucky to see more than a penny by the end of the week.
Oh, that wasn't included. Huh? That was deducted from the shilling pay? I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the conversion rates and the inflation from like 150 years ago, so I can't really put that into perspective, but it's interesting how it didn't cover those necessities.
But hey, it's a steady job.
And while you're with me, all you can drink. I turns off the tap never.
Basically, if you've just joined up, then chances are you're from the rural or urban poor. Rural recruits were preferred because they were generally tougher and dealt with authority better than the uppity old city boys. Until the mid-19th century, Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland were massively overrepresented. As John Laband points out in his exceptional book, half the rank and file came from the Celtic fringe rather than from England. But as the century progressed, recruits came increasingly from the depressed industrial centres of the English Midlands. After the Irish potato famine, the number of Irish in the ranks dropped significantly because of mass emigration and because growing Irish nationalism made service in the British Army less acceptable. Anyway, let's crack on. Welcome to your new digs. What are your...
Imagine being a tough, kind of lower class farm worker and then recruited into the army and having to go through tough experiences and then having a upper class person become like your superior officer, a new guy. I feel like that'd be infuriating.
Reckon that'd be less acceptable. Anyway, let's crack on. Welcome to your new digs. What do you reckon? The barracks. A dozen men packed into long rooms with beds so close you could barely roll over without getting a mouthful of someone else's foot. Fresh air? Nah, that's for wimps. There was a belief that fresh air brought chills and death, so the windows stayed firmly shut. Instead, you got a lovely smell of sweat, tobacco, smoke and piss. And by the way, you also shared with the wives and kids. But we'll come back to those later. Now you've settled in and you quickly start to learn drill. The British Army of the early Victorian period was still very much the same beast that had taken down Napoleon barely 2 decades earlier, and it still marched, drilled and fought like it had at Waterloo. Picture this, dense blocks of men moving like chess pieces, marching in columns, spreading out into lines, wheeling around like some bizarre human clockwork or folding back into squares when things got messy. Constantly practicing this transforms you from a clueless recruit to a proper soldier. Now before...
By the way, guys, I believe this is from I've seen the movie Waterloo. And these are all, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost positive. These are all real people. Think about that. That's really weird to think about in today's days of movie making.
Bizarre human clockwork or folding back into squares when things got messy. Constantly...
But I mean, you had to have all of these extras is just amazing.
Practicing this transforms you from a clueless recruit to a proper soldier. Now, before the Enlistment Act of 1870, military service was a long, hard slog, normally for 21 years in the infantry, 24 in the cavalry. And life in the cavalry was arguably even tougher than in the infantry. Cavalry recruits had the added headache of dealing with horses, and not everyone who signed up knew how to ride. Their day kicked off before dawn, scrambling to get dressed and sort out their bedding before the trumpet called them to duty at 5:15 a.m. Then it was straight to the stables to muck out the horses, followed by breakfast and then riding school. And the riding school wasn't for the faint-hearted. The riding master believed the best way to learn to ride was to fall off repeatedly. By 11 a.m. it was back to cleaning the stables, polishing horse tack, squeezing in some dinner, then foot drill, weapon drill, more time in the stables, and yet another round of kit cleaning. By the time their heads hit the pillow, cavalry recruits were knackered and had far less free time than their infantry mates. And what about grub? Well, there was no mess hall. Nope, as Ian Knight points out in his brilliant book, which most of this episode is based on actually, each room got one big copper cauldron shared by 12 infantrymen or 8 cavalry, and there was no such thing as a trained cook. The chef was just one of the lads roped into the job, and the menu was as uninspired as you'd expect. The daily ration, 3/4 pound of meat, maybe a pound if you were lucky, and it was mostly bone, a pound of rough tough bread, and sometimes a heap of potatoes. Uninspired as you'd expect. The daily ration, 3/4 pound of meat, maybe a pound if you were lucky, and it was mostly bone, a pound of rough tough...
Oh, you guys use pound for weight too. I forgot. I was so confused right there. Okay. Well, pound wasn't a thing yet. Or, crap. Never mind.
3/4 pound of meat, maybe a pound if you were lucky, and it was mostly bone, a pound of rough tough bread, and sometimes a heap of potatoes, if the stars aligned. Butter, cheese or a bit of rice counted as luxuries, and if you fancied a bit of fruit or veg, you'd need to go buy it from a hawker outside the barracks. Most meals were boiled beef and potatoes.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What? What? What?
In peacetime, the daily grind didn't change much. Reveille was at 6, and by 7 you were on parade. Breakfast was at 8, followed by endless drilling for recruits and menial tasks, aka fatigue duties. There was a second parade at noon, then dinner at 1 p.m, more drilling, and finally tea at 4 p.m. After that you were free, if you can call it that, until roll call at 9:30, lights out was at 10:15, and if you drew the short straw for guard duty, it was 12 hours manning the gates, searching everyone coming and going, and rounding up the occasional late night drunk.
With no sleep?
30, lights out was at 10:15. After that you were free, if you can call it that, until roll call at 9:30, lights out was at 10:15, and if you drew the short straw for guard duty, it was 12 hours manning the gates, searching
Oh, separated. I thought you'd have to go right to guard duty.
everyone coming and going, and rounding up the occasional late night drunk.
Okay, so I'm assuming... Okay, I'm assuming those duties were a bit dispersed and traded between people.
And
Because that'd be ridiculous. It's not like people back then... Maybe, okay,
If you
okay.
thought home duty sounds tough, then don't forget that the British Empire needed its soldiers to be everywhere. Canada,
Not the jungle, anywhere but the jungle.
India, Australia, even Tristan da Cunha, which is a speck of an island in the Atlantic, where at one point the garrison consisted of one very lonely Royal Marine. That's right, a single bloke who for a while was the governor, chief of staff, and the entire defence force all rolled into one. Crazy but true. Life was a series of long, grueling deployments. You could be sent to a place like India for 20 years, dodging diseases like cholera and dysentery, which could kill more men than any battle. And when you did face the enemy, it wasn't in the pristine, orderly battlefields you see in paintings. It was a smoky, chaotic, brutal mess. Okay, we've looked at your average Tom, but what about the Ruperts? As John Laband says, the 19th century officer corps gave the impression of being predominantly even aristocratic, even if that was actually not quite so. In 1883, there were 137 aristocrats. The 19th century officer corps gave the impression of being predominantly even aristocratic, even if that was actually not quite so. In 1883, there were 137 peers serving in the British Army and 417 officers from the so-called greater gentry, but the majority
Is peers just low rank?
were actually drawn from families in the higher professions of the church, law and medicine, who saw a commission as a path for upward social mobility.
Saw a commission for upward mobility, social mobility, or prestige as having that experience as social upward mobility? I'd imagine it was the latter, but that's not what he said.
It was possible in those days to be promoted from the ranks, to be a real-life Richard Sharp. In fact, during the 1830s, nearly 30% of all commissions were by that route. But Victorian values were a bit messed up. Decades of running the empire changed those attitudes until by the end of the 19th century, only 2% of officers came up from the ranks. Yep,
Wow.
getting a commission back then wasn't about...
Oh. I have this constant... when I hear stuff like that in videos like this, the British Army, extremely professional. You'd want the best of the best, but also only 2% rose up the ranks, which means you wouldn't really look for the best. You'd look for the more wealthy. But if you were more wealthy, it would mean that you probably have more officer training, which maybe it means you would be better. And so maybe the 2% isn't as bad if you want to find the best man for the job as you do. That makes sense, I hope.
One of officers came up from the ranks.
Confused.
Yep, getting a commission back then wasn't about what you knew, it was about who you knew and what you could pay.
But who you knew could also give you what you knew. Forget it.
The purchase system
What is that stance? I've never shot a gun in my life, but that doesn't look right.
meant that any young lad with enough cash, and the right connections as well, could buy his way in. In the 30 years leading up to the end of the system in November 1871, about 2/3 of infantry commissions were bought even, and a whopping 5/6 of the elite guards and cavalry. But it wasn't as simple as just waving around a fat wallet. You could only buy a commission when a vacancy popped up, and even then you needed the right nod from the top brass or a helpful nudge from someone well connected to seal the deal. And the price tag for buying a commission wasn't small change. In fact, it was incredibly expensive, and it left many officers stuck at their current rank, unable to afford the next step up the ladder. Even if you did have the cash, there was no guarantee of a promotion. Sometimes there just weren't any openings higher up. That's how you ended up with a bunch of middle-aged men stuck as junior officers, dreaming of the next big opportunity. So when active service did come, it was very welcome. It wasn't just about breaking the dull routine of peacetime, it was a chance to make a name for yourself and get noticed by the top brass. And let's be honest, it also meant there'd be some gaps opening up thanks to the grim realities of disease and death. That would get things moving for the promotion queue. Now, the purchase system is complicated and I've made videos on it before, so please look them up if you want to know more.
That was said nonchalantly, which made it more terrifying.
You're sitting in the Colonel's chair, old man.
My heavens. I shouldn't want to add sacrilege to my other crimes.
I'm the type of person who would I would not take that. But I know as soon as someone yelled in my face, this top officer, I'd be like, yes, sir. And I would completely cave.
Mid-19th century officer, there was one rule above all others: act like a gentleman. And what did that mean? Well, it meant the qualities like character, good breeding, confidence, and physical ability were far more important than any amount of book smarts or actual military training. Hunting, shooting, fishing, and socializing were the most...
Again, though, the book smarts. You might not be able to get book smarts unless you're of that upper class. And no matter how naturally brilliant you may be in the lower ranks, you'd have to be exceptionally brilliant to outperform those who also have the book training.
Most important pastime.
I'm beating a dead horse here. I've said that enough.
Actual military training. Hunting, shooting, fishing, and socializing were the most important pastimes.
Cheetah.
An officer who spent his time buried in manuals or, heaven forbid, studying tactics might even be looked at sideways by his mates, seen as a bit odd, maybe unmanly. But despite this, the best of them knew that when it came to battle, they'd better be right there in the thick of it. An officer who fought with his men...
What was unmanly?
Heaven forbid, An officer who spent his time buried in manuals or, heaven forbid, studying tactics might even be looked at sideways by his mates, seen as a bit odd, maybe unmanly.
Okay.
But despite this, the best of them knew that when it came to battle, they'd better be right there in the thick of it. An officer who fought with his men earned the respect the only way it mattered. Actually, you know what? Let me give a caveat to my generalisation about army officers of the period, and that's artillery and engineers. These branches were very technical, and the officers generally better educated and more serious about their profession. They deserve a film of their own, actually, so watch this space.
Who are you?
John Chard, Royal Engineers.
Okay, so in the intro, I promised a little bit of hanky-panky, and I'm sure you dirty buggers have been waiting to hear all about it.
Yes, well, you just give it to her, brother.
Cards on the table, though, you might be a bit disappointed, but here goes.
Yeah.
Firstly, soldiers had to get their commanding officer's permission to marry, and opinions were divided. Some colonels thought the presence of women helped create a more balanced environment. Others saw wives as a distraction and an extra expense. To keep things simple and cheap, most regiments only let about 6% of their men marry. Those official wives could live in the barracks and draw half rations for themselves and a quarter rations for their kids. But there wasn't much in the way of privacy or comfort. Imagine one corner of a noisy barrack room, screened off by a few blankets and strung up on a rope. Behind the flimsy curtain lived a married soldier, his wife and their kids, all packed together in a tiny space. The wife's unofficial role: keep the place tidy, wash and mend the men's uniforms. Now, to modernise, this might seem a bit shocking, but privacy wasn't really a thing in Victorian society, especially for the lower classes. Compared to the overcrowded slums of the time, where 30 people might be crammed into a single terraced house and as many as 20 to a room, the barracks might have seemed almost spacious. In these
maybe for some in society, all of these horrific conditions we've learned so far might be a step up, sadly.
Urban quarters, multiple
That's crazy.
Families shared beds to stay warm, and chamber pots were the standard, emptied each morning into overflowing cesspits. So when you stack up army life against that, maybe it's not quite so bad. You can see why some women might have found it to be an upgrade. Now, due to restrictions on marriage, many soldiers were forced to marry secretly and without their commanding officer's consent. Their wives and kids were what was known as off the strength. They weren't allowed to live in the barrack block, and if the soldier was transferred to a new station, they had to find their own transport. And things always got to...
What if one of the wives was gotten pregnant and had to give birth in those squalor... I'd imagine that infancy and birth rate mortality was even higher than in more civilized in back in, you know, London or whatever.
And if the soldier was transferred to a new station, they had to find their own transport. And things always got a bit complicated when the battalion deployed abroad. Only a handful of the wives were allowed to travel on the strength, meaning many were left behind with no one to support.
Oh, I thought some of the wives were for some reason, because Zulu was portrayed so much, I'm picturing like South Africa.
Them. For a large proportion, yep, prostitution was the grim fallback.
That's no surprise.
And talking of prostitution, all right, the Army's top brass has long been plagued by this problem. Commanders despised those women, not just for moral reasons, but for the headaches they caused in practice. Venereal diseases spread like wildfire among the ranks, leaving many soldiers unfit for duty. Now, a bit earlier, Samuel Pepys, on a visit to Tangier, observed that a young woman named Joyce, described as a mighty pretty creature, was said to have infected around 400 soldiers. She did more damage than the Moroccans. Anyway, fast forward to the Victorian era and things were getting out of hand. In 1859, there were a staggering 422 hospital admissions for VD for every 1,000 men. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, wives and...
I sort of feel bad for her being described that way, because I'm sure she received it from one of the soldiers earlier and then is like, you spread it everywhere. It's like, well, one of your soldiers gave it to me.
100 soldiers. She did more damage than the Moroccans. Anyway, fast forward to the Victorian era and things were getting out of hand. In 1859, there were a staggering 422 hospital admissions for VD for every 1,000 men. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, wives and travel. I got distracted. Those that did travel were an integral and important part of the regiment. For example, according to the National Army Museum website, Mrs. Rogers was the wife of an NCO at the camp of the 4th Dragoon Guards during the Crimean War. She acted as a cook and laundress for the regiment and was much admired for her bravery. In a letter dated June 1855, Colonel Edward Cooper Hodge described Mrs. Rogers as deserving the Crimean Medal 10 times more than half the men who did get it. And it wasn't just during the Crimean War, of course. There are plenty of stories of incredibly brave wives that I know off the top of my head just from the Peninsular War and the Indian Mutiny. So there you have it, the Victorian era British Army and their wives. I think it was a fascinating social experiment that, despite all of its quirks and eccentricities, somehow managed to work. The urban slum dweller fighting side by side with the lord of the manor, taking on Johnny Foreigner and coming out on top. Because when it came down to it, no matter your background, you were all soldiers, you were all British. You were all in it together. Subscribe and like for more fascinating tales from British military history. YouTube thinks you're going to enjoy the video that's on screen now, so check it out.
Hey, exactly. Right here. A bit, by the way, great video. A bit sobering to realize that as bad as it was for many Victorian urban poor, enlisting in the army was a step up in the world, which is probably correct. I thought of that. What's it matter if they're pissed or poxed as long as they can fight sharp? Great video. I really love that video. I honestly love the majority of videos I watch, okay? But this one is one of the better ones, I think. I picked them for a reason. I'm already interested in the subject, so love y'all. Hope you guys are all doing well. I do mean that, guys. If you're not doing okay, chin up. You'll be good soon. Emotions are fickle, my friend. And, yeah, I'd appreciate any comments down below, any answers to any of my questions I asked. You guys are always awesome with that. And hopefully I'll see you guys next time. We'll keep on watching, keep on learning. See you guys. Bye.